The first thing you must understand is that the warp is not whole everywhere. The Imperium teaches that the Immaterium is a single, infinite ocean of madness, lit by the Astronomican and ruled by demons that obey certain terrible laws. That belief keeps navigators sane and scholars orderly, but it is not entirely true. There are places where the warp thins, places where it fails to fully form, places where reality and unreality grind against each other, without ever resolving into either. Worlds like Hawkins are not cursed because the warp reached them. They are cursed because it didn't finish arriving. No Emperor's Light, no demon princes, just pressure, fear, and a slow psychic distortion that leaks inward over years. And the first ones to feel it are never soldiers or priests. They are children, minds unarmored, souls not yet reinforced by belief. If you are drawn to stories like this, where Warhammer lore fractures in dangerous, quiet ways rather than exploding into bolts of fire, then stay with me. And if you want more explorations of places the Imperium would rather classify than explain, take a moment to support the channel. Like the video, share with others who enjoy the darker edges of 40K speculation, and subscribe so these stories don't vanish into the archive vaults. The first symptom was not madness. It was discomfort. A pressure behind the eyes that no analgesic touched. A taste like iron on the back of the tongue when the lights flickered. Animals refusing to cross certain patches of ground. Whining softly as if the air itself offended them. Hawkins did not erupt into chaos the way worlds touched by the warp usually did. There were no cult sigils carved into walls, no ecstatic sermons, no spontaneous manifestations of demons clawing their way into reality. Instead, there was a persistent wrongness, subtle enough to be dismissed, constant enough to erode certainty over time. If an Imperial survey team had arrived in those early years, they would have found nothing actionable. No sanctioned psychers reporting visions. No astropathic bleed. No navigators collapsing in terror. Just a town that felt thin, as if the distance between thought and consequence had narrowed slightly, and no one could explain why. The warp did not arrive here in force. It stalled. In most of the galaxy, the Immaterium presses against reality, like a vast ocean against a hull. The Astronomican cuts a burning path through it. Belief hardens its currents, and demons take shape because there's enough psychic mass to support identity. Hawkins never reached that threshold. Whatever catastrophe or anomaly we can avail did not tear it open. It left it incomplete, frayed, unable to fully translate unreality into something that could be named. That incompleteness is what made it dangerous. Fear did not summon gods here. It pooled. It lingered. It soaked into places the way damp seeps into wood, invisible until something collapses. The air carried it faintly, like static before a storm that never broke. People grew irritable without reason. Nightmares clustered around the same symbols despite no shared source. Technology failed not explosively, but inconsistently, as if reality itself were having trouble deciding which rules to follow. The Imperium has no category for this. Administratum threat indexes rely on escalation. Psychic incidents spike. Heresy spreads. Xeno's activity increases. Hawkins produced none of that. Its danger curve was flat and quiet, which made it invisible to every doctrine built around crisis response. Even the Inquisition, if they had brushed against it at all, would have marked it as noise, background variance, statistical irrelevance. And yet, something was listening. The Upside Down did not behave like a realm. It had no hierarchy, no will, no intention. It mirrored without understanding, copied without purpose. Buildings existed because buildings existed above. Roads went nowhere because roads went nowhere. Organic growth spread not because it sought to conquer, but because growth was what biological systems did when exposed to stimulus without guidance. This was not chaos. Chaos wants. Chaos corrupts with promise and identity. This place offered nothing. It consumed because pressure demanded release, not because malice drove it. The warp here was unfinished, and unfinished things are unstable. Where the veil thins properly, the Emperor's light can anchor against it. Where it tears, demons can claw through. Where it stagnates, nothing arrives to impose order at all. The Immaterium presses, but finds no shape to fill. The result is a psychic vacuum that pulls at emotion rather than belief, sensation rather than doctrine. Adults felt unease and learned to rationalize it. Stress, work, cold weather. Children did not have that armor. Their minds had not yet been trained to dismiss fear as imaginary. Their thoughts had not been regimented by ritual or reinforced by belief systems that tell you what is real and what is not. In Hawkins, that made them receptive in the worst possible way. Not powerful, exposed. They dreamed of places they had never seen and woke up knowing the layout. They felt watched without seeing eyes. They sensed boundaries where none should exist. In Imperial terms, they would not qualify as psychers. There were no sanctioned abilities, no control manifestations, only sensitivity, the kind that hurts before it empowers. Fear became the dominant signal, not devotion, not rage. Fear is simpler. It does not require belief to function. It only requires anticipation. In an incomplete warp zone, anticipation is enough to distort reality in small, compounding ways. Sounds arrive half a second late. Shadows linger where light should have erased them. Reflections fail to sync perfectly with movement. Nothing dramatic. Nothing reportable. Just enough to teach the environment how to feel afraid. The Upside Down learned from that. Not consciously. Not intelligently. It learned the way mold learns dampness. The way rust learns moisture. It adapted to the only psychic input available to it. Copying fear the way a child copies language without understanding grammar. That is why it feels frozen in time, why nothing that progresses naturally. It is a snapshot of panic, endlessly replayed without context. This is why no demon speaks there. There is no narrative to inhabit, no hierarchy to climb, no god to serve, only pressure. If the warp had fully arrived, the Imperium would have noticed. If chaos had claimed it, there would be signs written in blood and scripture. Hawkins exists in the blind space between those certainties, and that makes it more dangerous than 1,000 screaming cult worlds. Because nothing there knows what it is yet, and unfinished things, given time, do not stay unfinished forever. The second symptom was absence, not disappearance in the way the Imperium understands it. No screaming Vox channels, no sudden warp signatures, no evidence of demonic incursion, but a softer erasure. Things stopped arriving where they should have. Sound failed to carry across short distances. People spoke and felt unheard even when words were exchanged. Memory itself grew unreliable, not because it was altered, but because it failed to anchor properly. Events slid past one another without friction, leaving gaps no one could quite define. In Hawkins, places went quiet before people noticed they were empty. The forest beyond the town limits was the clearest example. Birds avoided it in patterns too deliberate to be instinct alone. Insects fell silent in waves, the absence spreading outward like ripples in water. Even wind behaved differently there, slowing as if encountering resistance. To an Imperial auspex, the readings would have been useless. No radiation spike, no psychic flare, no measurable anomaly beyond environmental variance. But to a human nervous system, something was unmistakably wrong. The warp pressure had nowhere to go. In stable warp contact zones, psychic energy expresses itself through symbols, emotions, belief. In Hawkins, belief never formed strongly enough. There were no saints, no rituals, no psychic architecture to shape the intrusion. The Immaterium pressed inward and found nothing to latch onto. So it leaked instead, diffusing into the environment as distortion rather than manifestation. This is why the Upside Down feels empty. Not lifeless, there is growth, predation, movement, but empty of intent. Nothing there chooses. Nothing plans. Everything reacts. Structures exist because they are echoes, not because something wanted them to. The biological matter spreads because stimulus demands response, not because hunger drives it. It is the warp behaving like an unfinished thought. Imperial scholars would call this catastrophic if they could see it, but they wouldn't, because the Astronomican cannot illuminate what does not fully exist in the warp. Its light is not a lantern, it is a beacon. It draws the Immaterium into navigable coherence. Hawkins offers nothing for it to lock onto. No psychic mass, no devotional gravity. No structured soul density. Just scattered fear and emotional residue too weak to register as a signal. To the Imperium, Hawkins would appear mundane. To those inside it, the mundanity is a horror. Children began to notice that places remembered them even when people did not. A tree felt familiar before it was ever climbed. A corridor felt wrong before anything happened there. These were not premonitions. They were feedback. The environment reacting to psychic presence before conscious awareness caught up. In Imperial terms, this is backwards. Normally, the warp responds to thought. Here, thought was responding to warp pressure that had not resolved into identity. It created a feedback loop where fear reinforced environment and environment reinforced fear, without ever escalating into spectacle. That loop is sustainable. That is what makes it dangerous. The upside down is not a parallel realm. It is a pressure imprint. It exists because Hawkins exists. It decays because Hawkins decays. It does not invade. It accumulates. It does not corrupt. It reflects. Over time, reflections deepen. Details sharpen. Predatory behavior emerges not because something learned cruelty, but because systems under pressure simplify toward survival. This is why it hunts. Not with malice. With momentum. Every disappearance strengthens the echo. Every unprocessed trauma adds density. Every fear that is never named becomes structure. The upside down grows not by conquest, but by neglect. It is the Immaterium's equivalent of scar tissue, forming where reality was stressed and never properly healed. If the Imperium ever became aware of such a place, there would be argument. Some inquisitors would call for immediate quarantine, citing long-term instability. Others would dismiss it as irrelevant noise compared to active chaos incursions. The Adeptus Mechanicus would classify it as a data anomaly, unfit for exploitation. No one would prioritize it. There is no glory in suppressing something that has not finished becoming a threat. And that would be the mistake. Incomplete warp zones do not announce their climax. They mature quietly. Pressure builds until coherence snaps into place. And when it does, the result is never predictable. It will not resemble a demon world. It will not follow known warp hierarchies. Whatever emerges will be shaped by fear learned before belief, by instinct formed before identity. Hawkins is not haunted. It is incubating. And the longer it remains unseen, the more dangerous the moment becomes when the warp finally decides what it wants to be there. The third symptom was adaptation. Not adaptation in the heroic sense. No resistance, no immunity, no triumphant survival, but the quiet, biological kind that happens when a system accepts damage as permanent and learns how to function around it. Hawkins did not fight the pressure pressing into it. It adjusted its habits, its rhythms, its expectations. People stopped questioning certain sensations because questioning them required energy, and energy was better spent pretending nothing was wrong. This is how incomplete warp zones persist. Where chaos erupts, belief hardens quickly. Cult forms. Resistance forms. Lines are drawn. Hawkins never reached that stage. The pressure was too low, too constant, too unremarkable. It became background radiation for the human soul. You did not react to it. You grew up with it. Imperial doctrine assumes threat announces itself through escalation. More violence. More madness. More noise. Hawkins did the opposite. It normalized distortion until reality itself became negotiable. Without anyone realizing it had happened, people learned that some doors should not be opened. Some roads should not be taken at night. Some conversations should not be finished. They could not explain why. They simply felt the boundary and obeyed it. That obedience fed the echo. The upside down sharpened as Hawkins learned avoidance. Empty spaces grew denser. The mirrored structures gained texture not because something was building them deliberately, but because repeated fear gave the echo consistency. In warp terms, this is proto-coherence. The moment psychic residue begins to stabilize into pattern without yet becoming identity. It is the most dangerous phase. Demons are predictable. They want worship, sensation, excess, hierarchy. You can star them. You can trap them. You can banish them. A pressure echo wants nothing. It does not bargain. It does not tempt. It persists until the environment that created it changes or collapses. Children continued to be the fault line. Some learned to shut down emotionally, becoming numb in ways adults praise as maturity. Others became hyper-aware, reading mood and space with uncanny precision, adjusting their behavior constantly to avoid invisible consequences. From an Imperial perspective, none of these children would register as psychers. There were no sanctioned abilities, no telekinetic bursts, no telepathic bleed, only heightened perception paired with fragility. This is what happens when the warp touches minds before doctrine does. Faith normally acts as insulation. Even disbelief can function as a barrier if it is structured enough. Hawkins had neither. Belief there was casual, inherited, thin. It did not shape fear into ritual or prayer. It let fear wander freely, uncontained. The warp pressure learned from that, absorbing the emotional shape without the theological framework. That is why the upside down feels wrong in ways even hardened veterans of chaos incursions would struggle to articulate. There's no blasphemy there, no iconography, no profane language carved into reality. Just imitation without understanding. A world that knows how things look, but not why they exist. Predators emerged eventually, but they were crude, not masterminds, not generals. Biological responses to stimulus. Sound draws attention. Movement triggers pursuit. Fear amplifies signal. The upside down hunts because hunting is the simplest possible behavior that produces feedback. It is not evil. It is unfinished survival logic reinforced by psychic pressure. If this place had been discovered by the Imperium at the wrong time, it would have confused even the Ordo Malleus. No demonic taxonomy would fit. No chaos god could be blamed. Exterminatus would seem excessive for a threat that barely registered as real. The most likely outcome would be neglect, filed away as a statistical anomaly until something finally crossed a measurable threshold. By then, it would be too late, because incomplete warp zones do not stay incomplete forever. They either dissipate when psychic input dries up, or they stabilize when enough pattern accumulates to support identity. Hawkins was moving slowly toward the second outcome. Not fast enough to trigger alarms. Not loud enough to be noticed, but consistently. The upside down was learning boundaries, learning persistence, learning how long it could exist without attention. That is the most dangerous lesson any warp-adjacent phenomenon can acquire. Not how to invade, but how to wait. And somewhere beyond Hawkins, far beyond its forests, its labs, its small human dramas, there are forces that would notice that lesson eventually. Not because of what the upside down is now, but because of what it might become once fear finishes teaching it how to endure. The fourth symptom was familiarity. Not comfort, never that, but recognition. Hawkins learned the shape of its own fear, and the Echo learned how to wear it convincingly. This is the point where incomplete warp zones become most deceptive, because nothing appears to be escalating. People adapt so thoroughly that the abnormal is mistaken for personality rather than influence. Anxiety becomes a local trait. Isolation becomes cultural. Silence becomes polite. From the outside, Hawkins would read as unremarkable. From within, it felt watched in a way that did not provoke panic, only awareness. The sense that certain thoughts lingered longer than they should, that some memories replayed with too much clarity, while others slipped away without resistance. This was not possession. There were no voices, no commands, no intrusion of alien will. It was resonance. The environment responding to emotional frequency, the way a chamber responds to sound. The upside down began to anticipate, not intelligently, not strategically. It learned patterns because patterns were repeated. Fear spiked at night, so its activity mirrored night. Panic clustered around specific locations, so those locations deepened first. Trauma became a kind of map, traced over and over until the Echo followed it instinctively. Where fear went, pressure followed. Where pressure followed, distortion accumulated. This is how a warp Echo gains shape without gaining mind. In Imperial terms, this would be classified as predemonic coherence, a phase so rarely observed that most Scholastica texts treat it as hypothetical. The reason is simple. Most incomplete warp intrusions either collapse quickly or escalate violently. Hawkins did neither. It lingered in equilibrium. fed just enough emotional energy to persist, never enough belief to crystallize into hierarchy. That balance was fragile. Every time something went missing, the echo gained density. Not power, density. Like sediment settling at the bottom of still water. Over time, that sediment began to support structure. The mirrored world did not change because it wanted to. It changed because repetition forced definition. Walls thickened. Organic matter became more complex. The environment stopped decaying at random and began to decay consistently. Consistency is the precursor to identity. The most dangerous thing about Hawkins was not the monsters that eventually emerged. It was the town's acceptance of liminality. People learned to live between explanations. Authorities dismissed incidents because nothing fit established categories. Parents rationalized fear because acknowledging it required believing something impossible. That collective denial acted like insulation, trapping psychic pressure rather than releasing it. In places where chaos thrives, belief accelerates collapse. In Hawkins, disbelief did the same job more slowly. If the Imperium had arrived then, during this phase, they would have misread it entirely. There would be no justification for purge, no measurable psychic output, no evidence of Xeno's manipulation. At most, an Inquisitor might know elevated rates of anxiety and recommend observation. A Mechanicus surveyor might record electromagnetic irregularities and move on. Observation would have been fatal, because by this stage, the Upside Down no longer needed fear spikes to persist. It had learned continuity. The echo could exist even when people slept, even when nothing overtly wrong was happening. That meant the warp pressure was no longer purely reactive. It had stabilized enough to maintain itself. Not alive, but no longer transient. This is the moment where incomplete warp zones cross the point of no return. One psychic residue supports ongoing structure. Dissipation becomes unlikely without deliberate intervention. Left alone, the echo will continue to refine itself until it can host something more coherent. Not necessarily a demon, not necessarily a god, but a principle, a rule set, a way of behaving that persists regardless of individual emotion. Fear taught it how to endure. Silence taught it how to listen. Neglect taught it patience. This is why Hawkins is not merely a curiosity, but a warning. Not about chaos, but about the dangers of partial contact. The warp is not safe when fully sealed, and it is not safe when fully open. But it is most dangerous when it is allowed to linger unfinished, fed just enough to learn but not enough to be named. The Imperium fears demons because they can be fought. It fears gods because they can be opposed. It has no doctrine for phenomena that are still becoming. And that is what Hawkins represents. Not a battlefield, not a curse, but a threshold that no one noticed crossing. Because the warp does not always invade with fire and screaming hosts. Sometimes, it waits until reality forgets how to tell the difference between normal and wrong. And when that happens, the next stage is inevitable. Not invasion. Completion. Completion did not arrive as an event. There was no singular night when Hawkins crossed a line and could never return. It arrived the way rot does in a sealed room, slowly, invisibly, until the structure could no longer support its own weight. The Upside Down did not become more violent at first. It became more selective. The echo learned which presences caused distortion and which stabilized it. Loud fear was inefficient. Panic burned too hot, collapsing resonance as often as it fed it. What sustained the zone was quiet despair, unresolved grief, and the specific emotional profile of children who sensed something wrong but lacked the language to articulate it. Their minds were not stronger. They were simply less insulated. In the Imperium, this would have been recognized immediately, not as corruption, but as vulnerability. Untrained psychers do not explode because they are powerful. They fracture because they are open. Hawkins was open in the same way. Its children felt the pressure first because they had not yet learned to ignore intuition. The echo responded by narrowing its attention. Disappearances became precise. One at a time. Always someone isolated. Always someone already half removed from the town's emotional network. A bullied child. A neglected sibling. A loner whose absence could be rationalized before it had to be confronted. The echo was not hunting. It was pruning instability from its own environment, learning what kinds of removal did not provoke destabilizing belief. This is where the Imperium's absence becomes critical, because the only reliable way to destabilize an incomplete warp zone is exposure. Naming forces coherence too quickly, which either collapses the intrusion or forces it into a form that can be destroyed. Hawkins did the opposite. Every authority figure who dismissed events, every report that went unfiled, every explanation that substituted coincidence for investigation allowed the echo to continue refining itself unchallenged. The Upside Down did not want worship. It did not want acknowledgement. It wanted continuity. By the time physical organisms emerged, things that could be seen, touched, killed, the echo was already too structured to dissolve naturally. These creatures were not invaders. They were expressions, provisional bodies formed to interact with a reality that had stopped pushing back. This is where most observers misunderstand the threat. They assume the monsters are the problem. They are not. They are symptoms of an environment that has already failed. In a complete warp breach, demons impose meaning. They arrive with intent, hierarchy, hunger shaped by belief. In Hawkins, the environment imposed behavior instead. Creatures followed instinctual loops because the zone itself had learned those loops from repetition. Hunt where fear gathers. Withdraw when attention spikes. Avoid sustained confrontation. These were not tactical choices. They were environmental responses. The Upside Down was not expanding aggressively because it did not need to. It was already embedded. Its boundary was not spatial, but psychological. It existed wherever Hawkins' emotional patterns repeated themselves. Bedrooms, school corridors, forest trails, places layered with memory and neglect. That is why escape was possible at all. The echo was incomplete enough to be disrupted by contradiction. Courage still mattered. Sacrifice still destabilized it. Moments of collective action forced resonant spikes that the environment struggled to absorb. Every time people refused to behave as expected, refused isolation, refused denial, the echo lost coherence temporarily. But temporary loss is not the same as eradication. Each disruption left residue behind. The environment adapted. The next iteration learned from the last failure. Where fire destroyed organic matter, it learned to regrow differently. Where gates collapsed, pressure redistributed. Where belief threatened to crystallize, it diffused into ambiguity again. This is the most dangerous stage of all, because now the zone understood resistance. In Imperial doctrine, this is where extermination will be considered, not because the threat is at its strongest, but because it is becoming resilient. Once a warp-adjacent phenomenon begins adapting to interference without escalating, it is no longer safe to study or contain. It has learned to coexist. Hawkins survived his confrontations, but it did not resolve them. The gates did not close because the threat was ended. They closed because the system achieved a temporary equilibrium. Enough pressure was vented to prevent immediate collapse. Enough damage was done to prevent rapid expansion. The echoes settled into dormancy, not absence. Dormant warp zones are the Imperium's deepest nightmare. They are quiet. They are patient. They do not announce themselves until conditions are favorable again. And when they reemerge, they do so with memory. The Upside Down remembers what fear tasted like. It remembers which emotions sustained it and which destabilized it. It remembers resistance patterns. It remembers names, not as identities, but as emotional signatures etched into its structure. Hawkins will never be clean, not fully. Even if the gates never reopen visibly, the echo remains layered beneath the town like a pressure fault. Generations will grow up feeling unease without cause. Certain places will always feel wrong. Children will still sense things adults cannot articulate. The town will produce an abnormal number of intuitives, sensitives, people who feel too much and trust too little. From an Imperial perspective, this world would be marked, not for destruction, but for quiet monitoring, a redacted footnote in an inquisitorial archive, a location where recruitment for sanctioned psychers might quietly increase, a place never again allowed to believe itself normal, because incomplete warp zones do not vanish. They either escalate or they wait, and waiting is not passive. It is preparation without intent. The upside down does not dream of conquest. It does not plot revenge. It does not hunger in the way demons hunger. It persists, and persistence is enough. Because the warp does not require malice to be lethal. It only requires neglect. Neglect was a condition that allowed the echo to settle into the town's bones. What followed was not peace, but normalization. Hawkins rebuilt because humans always rebuild, especially when survival depends on pretending the worst is over. New paint went up over cracked walls. Classrooms reopened with revised floor plans that quietly avoided certain corridors. Families returned to routines that felt almost familiar, even as everyone agreed, without ever saying it, that something had shifted. The town learned to live around a wound it refused to name. This was not denial born of stupidity. It was adaptive behavior. In environments touched by incomplete warp phenomena, belief becomes dangerous not because it empowers intrusion, but because it gives it definition. Definition invites escalation. Hawkins instinctively chose vagueness instead. Stories became half-jokes, whispered exaggerations, things children were told not to dwell on. Adults learned to interrupt conversations before they reached clarity. The echo responded by remaining diffuse. It did not need fear to survive anymore. It had infrastructure. The upside down no longer required open gates. Its influence moved laterally instead of outward. Small behavioral changes appeared first. People lingered less in shared spaces. Eye contact shortened. Trust became conditional and brittle. Emotional bonds still formed, but they fractured more easily as the stress found fault lines faster than it should have. This was not possession. It was pressure. Pressure shapes environments over time. Children continue to feel it most strongly, though now in subtler ways. Nightmares without imagery. Anxiety without trigger. A persistent sense of being observed that could not be traced to any physical presence. In Imperial terms, these would be early indicators of latent psychic sensitivity. Individuals whose minds were brushing against something adjacent without ever fully crossing over. None of them would be trained. None of them would be protected. That was the difference. In the Imperium, untrained psychers are liabilities not because they summon horrors, but because they provide entry points. Hawkins became a population-scale version of that vulnerability. Not a beacon, but a soft spot, a place where the warp adjacent could lean without immediately tearing through. The echo learned to use memory as scaffolding. Locations tied to trauma retained greater resonance. Abandoned houses, forest clearings, sections of town where emergency services responded too often, too late. These places did not spawn monsters. They amplified emotion. Arguments escalated faster there. Despair lingered longer. People avoided them instinctively, which only deepened the isolation that sustained the effect. This is how incomplete warp zones entrench themselves. They do not dominate. They insinuate. Years passed without catastrophe, which paradoxically made Hawkins more dangerous. Without crisis, there was no justification for intervention. No one outside the town had cause to look closely. Data normalized. Deviations flattened out across statistical averages. From a distance, Hawkins was unremarkable. From within, it felt hollowed. Those who had survived the original events aged into a different kind of awareness. They did not speak about what they had seen, but their bodies remembered. Muscle tension that never fully released. A reflexive readiness for loss. They became protective in ways that were difficult to explain, hovering over younger siblings, reacting sharply to small absences, feeling dread when routines broke. The echo watched this too. It did not understand morality, but it recognized patterns of care. It learned that strong emotional bonds disrupted its equilibrium. Too much shared purpose forced coherence. So it applied pressure where it could, encouraging miscommunication, fostering resentment, amplifying misunderstandings. Nothing overt, nothing dramatic, just enough to thin the connective tissue. In time, even resistance became part of the system. This is a cruel genius of incomplete warp phenomena. They do not oppose opposition. They absorb it. Every attempt to move on fed the narrative that nothing needed to be addressed. Every refusal to remember prevented the formation of a coherent counterbelief that might have forced the echo into a vulnerable shape. Hawkins did not fall. It stagnated, and stagnation is survivable far longer than collapse. From an inquisitorial standpoint, this would be the moment of greatest concern, a dormant zone that has integrated itself into local psychology without escalating is no longer an outbreak. It is an ecosystem. Extermination would draw attention. Quarantine would disrupt trade and migration, creating questions. Observation would be the only viable option, which means waiting. And waiting favors a warp, because while humans age, forget, and die, the echo persists unchanged. It does not need to grow stronger. It only needs to outlast resistance. One generation that refuses to speak. Another that never knew there was anything to speak about. By the third, the pressure becomes baseline reality rather than anomaly. At that point, reopening is not an invasion. It is a return. The upside down does not require a villain to act on its behalf. It does not need a chosen herald or a grand alignment of stars. It only needs a moment when Hawkins' carefully maintained equilibrium finally breaks. Through disaster, through collective grief, through a fear too large to diffuse quietly. When that happens, the echo will not tear reality open. It will unfold into it. And by then, no one will remember a time before it was there. The moment of return would not announce itself with thunder or spectacle. There would be no crimson sky, no screaming alarms, no sudden understanding shared across the town. That was not how this kind of zone reasserted itself. It would begin with something small and rational, something that could be explained away without effort. A storm, perhaps. Power outages had always been common here. Lines went down. Transformers blew. Emergency shelters filled with families pressed together in gymnasiums and church halls. Stress and fear pooling in close quarters. In the dark, old instincts resurfaced. Children cried without knowing why. Adults snapped at one another, voices sharper than the situation deserved. No one noticed the pressure building, because pressure had become familiar. The echo would feel that familiarity like an invitation, not as hunger, as alignment. The sealed places would stir first. Bulkheads and boarded doors would groan as temperature gradients shifted in ways engineers could not quite explain. Animals would refuse to enter certain areas, their instincts recoiling from gradients the human nervous system could barely register. Electronic equipment would glitch in repeatable patterns, not random failure but rhythmic disruption, as if something were testing the boundary conditions again. Still, nothing dramatic. The worst thing would be how reasonable it all seemed. People would start losing time in minor ways. A walk that took 10 minutes would take 15 with no memory of delay. A conversation would repeat itself, not exactly, but close enough to feel wrong. Reflections would lag for half a heartbeat when no one was consciously watching. These were not hallucinations. They were synchronization errors between a town and the echo beneath it. By the time anyone realized something had returned, it would already be embedded. This is why incomplete warp zones are more dangerous than open breaches. An open gate declares itself. It forces response. A dormant echo waits until response becomes socially and psychologically impossible. Hawkins had spent years training itself not to respond. The children born after the first incidents would be different in ways that defied easy categorization. Not gifted, not cursed, simply attuned. They would ask questions adults found uncomfortable, not about monsters, but about feelings. Why certain places felt heavy. Why silence sometimes felt louder than noise. Why fear could exist without an object. These children would be dismissed as imaginative, sensitive, anxious. Some would learn to suppress it. Some would not. Those who could not would be drawn, slowly, toward the same fault lines their predecessors had walked without understanding. The forest edge, the abandoned structures, the places where memory pooled thickest. They would feel calmer there, paradoxically, because the pressure was consistent. Inconsistency is what hurts the most. The echo provided a steady gradient. This is a final adaptation. The environment becomes refuge. At that point, the upside down would no longer need to mirror Hawkins imperfectly. It would begin to override it selectively, not replacing matter, but influencing choice. People would choose isolation more often, choose silence, choose withdrawal over confrontation. Relationships would fail not explosively, but quietly, through erosion. No one would call this corruption. They would call it life. From the Imperium's perspective, if it were ever allowed to observe openly, this would mark the transition from unstable phenomenon to self-sustaining zone, not worth extermination. Too late for simple containment. The kind of place that gets watched for centuries and never fully understood. A place that produces anomalies rather than events. The echo would not create monsters anymore. Monsters attract attention. Instead, it would shape people who behave just slightly wrong, who made decisions that weakened collective action at critical moments, who instinctively avoided solutions that required trust or unity. The warp does not always break worlds with claws and fire. Sometimes it hollows them with patience. And yet even here, the system would not be invincible. There would still be moments, rare, volatile, where collective clarity emerged, where enough people recognized a pattern at once to force coherence. A disaster narrowly avoided through cooperation. A truth spoken aloud that could not be immediately dismissed. A generation that refused to inherit silence. In those moments, the echo would recoil, not retreat, but destabilize. These would be dangerous times. The environment would push back harder, producing acute manifestations instead of subtle ones. Accidents would spike. Mental health crises would cluster. Reality itself would feel brittle, as if a wrong step might shatter something unseen. Most societies choose comfort over confrontation. Hawkins likely would too. The cycle would continue, not as repetition, but as refinement. Each iteration teaching the echo what not to do, how to persist with less resistance, how to coexist without triggering alarms. This is the ending the Imperium fears most. Not damnation, not annihilation. Assimilation without awareness. A warp-adjacent influence so integrated that removing it would cause more damage than leaving in place. A reality where humanity adapts to distortion rather than rejecting it, where the abnormal becomes baseline. The upside down would never conquer Hawkins. It would become part of it. And one day, far in the future, someone might notice that the town produces an unusual number of individuals who feel disconnected from consensus reality, who struggle elsewhere but thrive in isolation, who find comfort in liminal spaces and unease in crowds. They might speculate about environmental factors, about inherited trauma, about cultural patterns. They would be correct. They would just never know how deep it went, because the most complete victory the warp ever achieves is not terror. It is normalization. Normalization does not feel like surrender. It feels like maturity, like a town that has learned its limits and stopped demanding explanations it cannot use. Hawkins would come to pride itself on resilience, on the quiet way it endured without spectacle. Tragedies elsewhere would seem louder, messier, easier to point at. What happened here would be spoken of as something subtler, something survived through grit and common sense rather than miracles or monsters. That story would be comforting. It would also be wrong in ways that mattered. As the years layered over one another, the echo's influence would become harder to distinguish from personality. People would describe Hawkins' residents as reserved, introspective, unusually independent. They would say the town-bred thinkers, loners, artists who worked best in isolation. None of this would sound like warning. It would sound like character. Sociologists might even praise it, pointing to lower crime rates, tighter family units, a culture that valued privacy and emotional self-regulation. On paper, the town would look stable. Stability, in this context, would be an illusion maintained by pressure. The sealed places would remain sealed, long after their original purpose had been forgotten. New buildings would be constructed around them rather than over them, plans subtly adjusted by people who could not articulate why certain areas felt wrong to disturb. These architectural absences would become part of the town's layout. Negative spaces everyone accepted without question. Children would grow up knowing there were places you did not go, not because of rules, but because of feeling. That instinct would be passed down like a genetic trait. Every so often, someone would try to break the pattern. A developer from outside town, armed with permits and optimism, would propose revitalization. Old zones reopened. Forgotten corridors cleared. The work would begin smoothly enough, then falter, equipment failures, worker illness, unexplained accidents clustered tightly enough to suggest coincidence, but not tightly enough to prove anything. Insurance claims would mount. Projects would be abandoned. The town would shake its head and say some things just weren't meant to be built there. The echo would remain undisturbed. It would not hate these interruptions. Hatred implies engagement. It would simply outlast them. The people most affected would never be the loudest. They would be the ones who felt slightly misaligned everywhere else. Hawkins natives who left and found the world too sharp, too crowded, too demanding. They would return home eventually, drawn back by something they could not explain. Here, the pressure made sense. Here, the quiet matched what they carried inside. They would build lives that looked small from the outside, but felt manageable from within. In Imperial terms, these would be classified as low-level sensitives, individuals whose psychic presence was not strong enough to manifest overt phenomena, but strong enough to register environmental distortions. In a controlled system, they might have been identified, trained, or coded. In Hawkins, they were simply absorbed. This absorption would be the echo's final defense. By embedding itself into identity rather than event, it ensured that any attempt to remove it would feel like an attack on the town itself. To question the environment would be to question the people shaped by it. Any outside authority attempting intervention would be met not with panic, but with quiet resistance. This was our home. This was how things were. Nothing was wrong enough to justify disruption. From the outside, that argument would be persuasive. From within, it would feel necessary. The echo would never fully breach again because it would no longer need to. Its presence would be sustained by habit, by avoidance, by a shared agreement not to look too closely at what could not be easily fixed. The warp, in this incomplete form, would achieve something demons rarely do. It would be tolerated, and tolerance is more enduring than fear. If the Imperium were watching, and it would be, distantly, through instruments that measure probability rather than belief, Hawkins would be logged as a managed anomaly, not a threat vector, not a resource, simply a place where reality behaved slightly differently and always had. Over centuries, the notation would sink deeper into archive layers, referenced only by those trained to notice such things. A footnote among millions. That is how the most dangerous zones survive. Not by drawing attention, but by becoming mundane. The upside down, incomplete, and adaptive would never fulfill the role of a traditional warp incursion. It would not crown champions or demand sacrifices. It would not rewrite the sky or tear planets apart. It would do something far more insidious. It would teach humanity how to live with distortion without ever naming it as such. And humanity, remarkably good at adaptation, would comply. In the end, there would be no final battle for Hawkins. No cleansing fire. No revelation that forced a choice between destruction and salvation. There would only be continuation. A town that carried a fault line through generations and learned to step around it so carefully that no one remembered why. That is the fate of a broken warp zone left unattended. Not apocalypse. Inheritance. And somewhere far beyond Hawkins, in a galaxy that has learned this lesson many times, the Imperium would recognize the pattern even if the people living inside it never could, because this was not unique. It was simply smaller, quieter, easier to ignore. The warp does not always break worlds by force. Sometimes, it waits for them to accept it as normal. That is, when it truly wins. The question Hawkins would never ask, and the question the Imperium never answers aloud, is not whether such places can be saved. It is whether saving them would cost more than allowing them to remain exactly as they are. And in that silence, the echo endures. There is a point where observation becomes indistinguishable from abandonment. If anyone were still watching Hawkins by then, and that was never guaranteed, they would not be watching through eyes or augurs or sanctioned psychers. They would be watching through probability drift, through minute deviations in predictive models that never quite resolve back into baseline. Hawkins would appear again and again as a statistical outlier that refused to escalate, always slightly wrong, never wrong enough. That was the most damning trait of all, because in the Imperium, intervention is justified by catastrophe. Whole worlds burn because the alternative is worse. Here, There would be no justification. No singular moment where the cost of action outweighed the cost of inaction. Hawkins would sit forever in that narrow band where disruption seemed unnecessary and mercy seemed premature. So the town would be left alone, not because it was safe, but because it was stable. Generations would pass without ever learning the word that might have given shape to what they lived inside. The Upside Down would not be remembered as a place, a realm, or an enemy. It would survive as mood, as temperament, as an inherited way of thinking that prized quiet endurance over confrontation. The children who grew up there would not speak of monsters. They would speak of anxiety, of restlessness, of the feeling that something was always just out of reach and always watching without intent. They would be told this was normal, and for them it would be, this is a final outcome of a broken warp zone that never healed and never fully broke through. It becomes invisible by becoming familiar. It stops being an invasion and becomes an environment. No one fights an environment. They adapt to it or leave it. Most would adapt. Those who left would carry the echo with them in subtler ways, never fully at home elsewhere, never fully understanding why. If this were written into an Imperial archive at all, it would not be framed as a failure. It would be framed as a success of containment through non-interference. A case study in minimal escalation. A reminder that not every anomaly requires purification, and that sometimes the safest course is to let a wound scar over rather than cutting open again. What that archive would never record is the human cost of that choice. Not in deaths, not in ruined cities, but in diminished possibility. In a town that might have been something else if clarity had arrived when it still mattered. In generations shaped by a pressure they never consented to and never fully perceived. The warp does not always demand worship or blood. Sometimes it is content to be accepted. That acceptance does not feel like defeat. It feels like peace. And that is why it is so dangerous. This is where the story ends, not with an explosion or revelation, but with a quiet continuation that no one inside it recognizes as an ending at all. Hawkins remains. The echo remains. Reality bends just enough to be survivable, never enough to be questioned openly. The Imperium understands this pattern well. It has let worlds like this exist before, not because they are harmless, but because they are useful reminders of a truth too uncomfortable to teach directly, that some threats are not conquered. They are endured, and endurance, stretched far enough, can hollow anything. That is what the Upside Down ultimately is. Not a battlefield, not a monster, but a lesson in what happens when a fractured reality is allowed to become routine. And once routine sets in, nothing short of catastrophe will ever feel justified enough to change it. That is the final victory of a broken warp zone. Not invasion, not annihilation, but inheritance. Inheritance is not dramatic. It does not arrive with banners or warnings. It arrives the way habits do, slowly, invisibly, until questioning them feels unnatural. By the time anyone might have thought to ask whether Hawkins had been lost, the question itself would feel misplaced. Lost compared to what? There was no before worth measuring against. The town functioned. Children grew, left, returned, or stayed. People married, divorced, prayed, argued, forgave, and buried their dead. Life continued with all the expected rhythms. Only the tone was different, subtly flattened, like music played through a wall rather than the open air. If you listened closely, you could hear it in how people spoke about the future. Plans were practical, cautious, rarely expansive. Ambition existed, but it was inward-facing. Dreams were personal rather than communal. No one imagined Hawkins becoming something larger than itself. That kind of imagining required a belief in upward momentum, and momentum had never felt stable here. The echo did not suppress hope. It thinned it, and thinning was enough. Occasionally, someone would arrive from outside and notice the difference immediately. They would comment on the quiet, not as peace but as restraint. They would ask why people seemed polite but distant, why conversations ended just before becoming vulnerable. Hawkins' residents would smile, shrug, say that was just how things were. Outsiders would either adapt or leave. Those who adapted stopped noticing the difference. Those who left carried the impression with them, unable to articulate it, certain only that the town had felt heavier than it should have. The echo did not follow them. It did not need to. It had already done its work. In time, the original events would pass fully into myth, not folklore. Folklore preserves shape, but into something less coherent. A vague sense that bad things once happened here, that children used to go missing, that the town had been through a lot. No detail survived intact long enough to form a warning. Memory without specificity is harmless. It cannot mobilize. It cannot accuse. That is why the warp favors it. If the Imperium were honest with itself, and it never fully is, it would recognize Hawkins as a familiar outcome. Not a tragedy, not a triumph, but a compromise. The kind of compromise empires make when certainty costs too much. Leave the fracture alone. Let it stabilize. Let humanity adapt around it. Record the anomaly. Monitor quietly. Move on, because there are always larger threats. There are always louder wars. And places like Hawkins are easy to forget precisely because they do not scream. They whisper. They persist. They demonstrate, over generations, that reality does not need to collapse to be altered, that people will accept distortion if it arrives gradually enough and asks for nothing explicit in return, that the most efficient way to change a world is not to conquer it, but to convince it that nothing is wrong. The Upside Down never wanted domination. It wanted accommodation, and it received it. That is the ending no one notices. No final gate. No last stand. No cleansing fire. Just a town that learned to live slightly out of alignment and stopped imagining anything else was possible. From the outside, Hawkins survived. From the inside, something essential narrowed quietly without ever breaking. And in a galaxy filled with worlds that burn for their defiance, the Imperium would consider that outcome acceptable, perhaps even preferable. Because nothing terrifies an empire more than the idea that clarity might demand change. So the echo remains, not as a threat, not as a monster, but as a reminder buried so deeply into routine that no one thinks to dig out again. That is how broken warp zones endure. That is how silence wins. And that is where the story ends. Not with destruction, but with continuation, which is far more difficult to undo. Then the last thing that survives is not the echo itself, but the habit it taught. Years later, no one in Hawkins will remember learning to be careful. They will simply be careful. Careful with words. Careful with hope. Careful with attention. Children will grow into adults who sense when to stop asking questions long before anyone tells them to. They will call it intuition, maturity, common sense. They will never call it inheritance. Because inheritance implies something was passed down deliberately, and nothing about this ever felt chosen. If someone were to stand at the edge of the town at the right hour, when the light is low and the air feels heavier than it should, they might feel it then. Not fear, not danger, just a faint resistance, like walking against a current you cannot see. Most would turn back without realizing why. A few would stay and feel strangely at ease, as if they had finally stepped into a rhythm that matched their own. The echo would not react. It would not need to. It would already be where it belonged. This is the part no warning ever captures. That survival does not always mean escape. That adaptation can look identical to healing from the outside while hollowing something essential from within. That a world does not have to fall to be lost to what shaped it. Hawkins will endure. It will remain on maps. Children will still laugh there. People will still fall in love. None of that will be false. It will simply be narrower than it could have been, constrained by a pressure no one remembers consenting to. And in the far future, whether watched by distant authorities or ignored entirely, the pattern will repeat somewhere else. Another incomplete breach. Another quiet compromise. Another place that learns to live around what should have been confronted. Because the most dangerous fractures in reality are not the ones that tear a world apart. They are the ones that teach worlds how to live broken. And once that lesson is learned, it rarely needs to be taught again. And with that lesson absorbed, the story no longer needs to move forward. Because nothing changes after this, only the scale at which the same choice is repeated. Hawkins does not collapse. It does not erupt. It does not become a warning anyone else is forced to heed. It simply persists functioning well enough that intervention always feels excessive, curiosity always feels impolite, and memory always feels optional. The echo does not tighten its grip, because it does not have to. It is already woven into behavior, expectation, and silence. It had become indistinguishable from the town's character. This is what makes it complete. Not the opening of gates, not the presence of monsters, but the disappearance of the question that once demanded an answer. In the Imperium, worlds like this are never spoken of in sermons or histories. They do not inspire crusades or martyrdom. They are footnotes buried in sealed strata, marked stable and left to age quietly. They are reminders that the warp does not always announce itself as an enemy. Sometimes it presents itself as a condition, something endured rather than opposed. And humanity, endlessly adaptable, accepts the condition. The tragedy is not that Hawkins was changed. All worlds are changed by something. The tragedy is that the change required no consent and left no language behind to resist it. No final stand. No cleansing fire. Just a gradual narrowing of what felt possible until possibility itself learned to stay quiet. That is how the broken warp zone truly wins. Not by conquest. Not by corruption. But by teaching a place to survive in a way that never asks to be whole again. And once that lesson settles into habit, there is no invasion left to stop. Only continuation. Only inheritance. Only silence. Doing exactly what was always meant to do.